At 57, Grace had settled into a gentle rhythm of life. Early mornings in her backyard garden, birdsong on the white wooden fence, and quiet afternoons with a warm cup of tea and an old romance novel. After more than 30 years of marriage, she and Edward, her dependable, intelligent, and soft-spoken husband, had built a peaceful world together, where surprises felt like things of the past. And yet, the surprise came on a Friday night that seemed utterly harmless. They had been invited to dinner by Daniel, Edward's longtime colleague, and his wife Rebecca. Daniel was slightly younger, with early silver in his hair, and a self-assured smile that made people naturally gravitate toward him. Grace had met them a few times at company events but never paid much attention. Rebecca, elegant and gracious, was the kind of woman who could make even a simple meal feel like an occasion. Their house, a charming old colonial with a wide porch and warm lights spilling from shuttered windows, welcomed them with soft jazz playing in the background and the comforting scent of roasted garlic and rosemary. Rebecca greeted them with an embrace and a radiant smile. "Grace, I'm so glad you came," she said, her voice as warm as the candlelight flickering along the hallway. Dinner was cheerful, filled with wine, stories from Daniel's recent business trip, and the familiar twinkle in Edward's eyes when he laughed, something Grace hadn't paused to notice in years. Everything felt pleasant, even forgettable, until dessert arrived, a silky chocolate mousse topped with ripe raspberries. That's when Daniel turned to her. "Edward tells me you're quite the gardener," he said, half grinning. "I've been losing the war with my roses. Any chance you could take a look?" Grace chuckled softly. "I wouldn't say I'm talented, just patient with dirt. Maybe after dinner, you could spare a few minutes?" Edward and Rebecca were lost in conversation about Italy and travel plans, so Grace nodded. Daniel led her out to the backyard, bathed. In golden porchlight and moonlight, the garden was quietly beautiful. The roses looked a little weary, drooping under the weight of evening dew and dim fairy lights strung across the fence. "See how the leaves are yellowing at the edges?" Daniel asked, crouching beside one bush. Grace knelt down next to him. "Probably needs more nitrogen," she said, reaching to touch a stem. "Grace," he said softly. His tone had shifted. She turned toward him, her hand still brushing the rose's leaves. "There are things I haven't been able to say to anyone," Daniel continued. "But tonight, looking at you, I felt something different. Something close." She blinked, startled. "Daniel!" And before she could say more, he leaned in and kissed her. It was brief, feather-light, but enough to make the world tilt for a moment. Grace pulled back, her breath caught in her throat. "Daniel?" He stepped back too, visibly shaken. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have—" She didn't know what to say. Inside her was a storm of feelings, confusion, guilt, and something else, something she hadn't felt in years. "Should go back inside," she whispered, barely audible. Daniel nodded, but his gaze lingered on her as they walked back in, like a man who had just stumbled upon something he didn't know he'd been searching for. Grace stepped back into the house, her heartbeat still out of rhythm. The warm light of the living room, the cheerful laughter of Edward and Rebecca, the soft jazz, everything felt familiar. But inside her, something had shifted. Daniel followed, quietly behind her, respectful and composed. No one noticed anything out of place. She sat back beside Edward, feeling the warmth of his presence, and also a strange, growing distance she had never allowed herself to acknowledge. The evening ended with polite goodbyes and well-practiced smiles. On the way home, Edward chatted about a new colleague, an upcoming meeting. Grace smiled, nodded at the right moments, but her thoughts stayed somewhere else, back in that garden, under the faint porch lights, where Daniel had touched a part of her soul she didn't even remember existed. That night, while Edward slept, peacefully beside her, Grace stared at the ceiling, eyes wide open. Her heart was restless, spinning with questions she had no name for. Was it just a passing moment? A reaction to kindness and attention? Or had Daniel unknowingly reached into the quiet loneliness she had buried under years of habit and routine? Had only kissed her briefly. No promises, no plans, just a kiss. But it was enough to awaken something she couldn't quite explain. The days that followed unfolded as usual. Grace tended the garden, cooked their meals, read quietly in the afternoons. But now, every quiet hour brought Daniel's face to her mind like an echo. She didn't reach out, nor did he. But her heart never stopped replaying the moment. Then, one afternoon while she was pruning lavender, Edward's voice called out from the porch. "Honey, you've got a visitor." She looked up and her breath hitched. Daniel. He stood at the edge of the yard in a soft blue button-down and jeans, holding a small potted rose. His expression was warm, cautious, like someone who knew each step forward could change everything. "I'm sorry to show up unannounced," he said gently. "I just had a few more questions about rose care." His voice carried a hint of nerves, but his eyes said otherwise. He wasn't there for the roses. Edward smiled, unaware. "You two gardening experts can chat. I'll go fix some tea." Once, alone, Grace stood up, wiping her hands on her apron, heart pounding beneath her calm exterior. "Are you okay?" Daniel asked softly. She nodded, unsure of her own answer. Silence fell between them. Birds chirped somewhere nearby. The scent of jasmine drifted on the breeze. "I wanted to apologize for that night," Daniel said finally. "I crossed a line, but pretending we didn't feel something also feels dishonest." Grace met his gaze, her heart heavy with questions. She had rehearsed ways to deflect, to draw boundaries, but his eyes, gentle, sincere, unpressuring, softened her resolve. "Daniel," her voice wavered, "I've shared a life with Edward. He's kind, dependable. We've built everything together. But you?" She couldn't finish the sentence. Daniel stepped forward slowly. "I'm not here to take anything away from you. I only want you to know you're not alone in this feeling. And if friendship is all we're allowed, I'll take it. Gladly." Grace lowered her gaze. But in that still moment, Daniel reached out and gently lifted her chin. Their eyes met. And this time, when he kissed her, it was no longer a mistake. It was soft, unhurried, but real. A kiss that carried no demands, only acknowledgement that she was seen, desired, alive. When they pulled apart, her eyes shimmered, not from guilt, but from awakening. She had never expected to fall in love again, not with someone else, but with a part of herself long forgotten. "We won't cross the line," she whispered, "but I need to understand what my heart is telling me." Daniel nodded. "I'm here, not to hold you back, but to remind you that you have the right to choose." After that afternoon in the garden, Grace and Daniel didn't meet again right away. But messages began to appear. Not frequent, not insistent, just enough to stir something deep within her. At first, they were about gardening. "Sun's out today. Have you walked through your garden yet? Did that lavender you trimmed last week bloom? I thought about your rose tip this morning. You really do have a gift." But slowly, the words shifted. There were pauses between sentences, unspoken meanings beneath the lines. "I know I shouldn't say this, but Grace, do you know how incredibly strong and gentle you are?" Each message made her heart flutter like a delicate string touched lightly by wind. She didn't always reply. But she always read them, again and again, especially when the afternoon felt too quiet, or when Edward buried himself behind a newspaper while the tea grew cold on the table. She still loved Edward, a quiet, enduring love like roots deep in the soil. But the feeling Daniel brought her, it was like a breeze she hadn't felt in years, a soft gust that smelled like rain after drought. The last message before a full week of silence read, "The annual gala's this Saturday. Rebecca and I will be there. Edward said you'll be coming too? If so, I hope I'll get to see you." Grace didn't reply, but her heart had answered long before the message arrived. That evening, she chose her dress with care, a soft lilac, silk, simple but elegant, not to impress anyone, but for herself. It had been a long time since she had looked in the mirror and thought, "I want to be seen." Edward looked sharp in his suit, warm and cordial as always. He introduced her to colleagues, held her hand as they walked into the ballroom, whispered polite remarks as music floated through chandeliers and glasses clinked around them. But Grace only truly noticed one man, Daniel. He stood across the room, beside Rebecca, dressed in gray, eyes lighting up the moment they met hers. It was brief, but powerful. A look of recognition, not of desire. As if he saw her, not just tonight, but always. Throughout dinner, their glances slipped quietly between small talk and clinking forks. The air between them held words no one else could hear. Between polite laughter and practiced smiles, they shared a current, a silent, pulsing connection neither could ignore. After the meal, Edward invited Rebecca onto the dance floor. They laughed and moved away with the other couples, leaving Grace and Daniel sitting across from each other in a moment that suddenly felt fragile and electric. Daniel stood, offered his hand. "Would you dance with me?" Grace hesitated, just for a second. Then she placed her hand in his. Out on the floor, under soft golden lights, they swayed gently, not speaking, not needing to. Daniel's hand rested lightly on her back, and her fingers curled naturally against his. "You look beautiful tonight," he whispered. She blinked away the emotion rising in her throat. "Daniel, we agreed we'd stay friends." He gently stepped back just an inch, looking into her eyes. "Friendship doesn't stop me from seeing how extraordinary you are, and it doesn't stop me from caring." They moved slowly to the music, caught in a space between caution and longing. It was comforting and torturous. When the music ended, they paused. He didn't let go of her hand. Instead, he leaned forward, kissed her forehead, softly, reverently. No urgency, no demand, just a kiss that acknowledged the truth neither could deny. She stepped back. Her breath caught somewhere between guilt and yearning, but her eyes, when they met his, were no longer hiding. After the gala, Grace tried to return to her daily rhythm, but nothing felt the same. Each glance from Edward stirred a quiet ache inside her. Not guilt exactly, but a realization. She was living two lives. One with the man she had shared decades of love and routine with, and another within a silent storm that had only just begun. Daniel didn't message her for 2 days. Grace assumed he was giving her space, or perhaps regretting everything. But then, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, her phone buzzed. One message short and unmistakably urgent. "Grace, I need to talk. It's important." Her breath caught. This wasn't curiosity anymore. This was something real. They met at a quiet cafe just outside town, the kind of place where nobody knew their names. Grace arrived first, the soft scent of coffee in the air. Daniel sat in a corner booth, his hands clasped tightly together, his face more serious than she had ever seen. "Thank you for coming," he said softly. "What's going on?" Grace asked, trying to steady her voice. He exhaled. "Rebecca knows." Everything inside her went still. "She sensed it at the gala," Daniel continued. "Last night she asked me directly. I couldn't lie." "What? Did you tell her?" "I told her the truth, that nothing physical had happened. But emotionally, something had." Grace looked down, her fingers trembling around her coffee cup. "What did she say?" "She was quiet for a long time," he replied. "And then she said if this was something real, I needed to speak to you, to be clear. Not just with you, but with myself." The air between them felt thick, heavy with the weight of honesty. Daniel gently reached across the table, touching her hand. "If you want to walk away, I'll understand. But if any part of you feels what I feel, we need to stop pretending. We need to name it." Grace didn't speak right away. She wasn't sure which emotion rose stronger, the fear of hurting Edward or the relief of finally being seen. "I have to tell Edward," she whispered. "He deserves the truth." Daniel nodded. "I'm not asking for anything else. Just honesty, from you to him and to yourself." That evening, Grace found Edward in the living room reading the paper. The house was quiet except for the ticking of a clock and the distant hum of wind outside. "Edward," she said, barely above a whisper. "Can we talk?" He lowered the paper slowly, sensing something different in her tone. "I need to tell you something," she began. "It's difficult." He waited, calm and still. "Lately, I've felt something I didn't expect. A connection. With someone else. With Daniel." For a moment, silence. Then Edward exhaled. "I thought so," he said gently. "At the gala. The way he looked at you. The way you looked back." Tears welled in her eyes. "I never meant for this to happen. I love you. You've been my whole life. But this feeling, it woke something in me." He reached over, took her hand. "Thank you for telling me," he said. "You could have hidden it, but you didn't." She looked at him, stunned by his calm. "I'm so sorry." He shook his head. "Don't apologize for being human. 30 years is a long time. Love changes. People grow. But I still respect you. Maybe even more now." Her heart broke gently. How could someone be this kind when she was the one who had drifted? "I don't know what to do," she whispered. Edward squeezed her hand. "Then take time. Figure it out. I just want you to be happy, even if that means facing change." In that moment, Grace saw him fully, not just as her husband, but as the man who had always loved her enough to let her be herself, even when it hurt. After that night, the house fell into a different kind of quiet. Not the kind that comes from anger or distance, but the kind that grows when two people are carefully, gently trying to find their way back to each other, or somewhere new altogether. Grace still prepared dinner, still poured Edward his morning tea. But between them now was something new. Not tension, not resentment. Just space, necessary, silent space to think, to feel, to breathe. One afternoon, while Grace was watering the garden, Edward approached her with 2 cups of tea. "I made you." "On," he said simply, his voice as steady as ever. She took it from him, grateful for the gesture. They sat side by side on the wooden bench beneath the flowering vines, the kind they had planted together years ago. "I've been thinking," Grace began, her voice soft but firm, "about all of this. About you. About Daniel. About me." Edward stared ahead, his eyes on the row of white daisies blooming in neat lines. "I still love you," she said. "That hasn't changed. But I also feel like I've woken up from a very long sleep, like I've been living as a role for so long. Your wife, the quiet woman who keeps everything in place. But somewhere along the way, I forgot to be me." Edward was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded. "I understand," he said. "I forgot to see you as more than just my partner in routine. You're still the woman I fell in love with, but maybe I stopped looking for the full picture." Grace's Voice trembled. "Are you angry with me?" He turned to her, calm and thoughtful. "Yes," he said gently. "But not because you felt something for someone else. I'm angry at myself for letting us drift so far that you felt invisible." Her tears came quietly, less like a storm, more like spring rain. She wasn't crying because of shame. She was crying because, for the first time in a long time, she felt seen by the very man she thought had stopped seeing her. That night, they didn't talk much. But when they went to bed, Edward reached for her hand. It wasn't a romantic gesture. It wasn't habit. It was a simple human act of presence. And Grace held on. The next morning, Grace rose early. She made coffee and stood by the window, watching birds flutter over the garden. Daniel hadn't reached out since her confession. She respected that. His absence felt both like a loss and a kindness. She no longer felt like she was hiding. Everything was out in the open now. Whatever came next would be built on truth, not impulse, not secrecy. A few days later, Daniel sent her a message. "I don't want to intrude, but I wanted you to know I'm here if you ever want to talk." Grace read it several times. She didn't reply. Not yet. She needed to be sure that whatever decision she made, it wasn't a reaction. It was a choice. That evening, she walked into the living room where Edward sat reading. She sat down across from him, her hands resting on her knees. "I think I need to go away for a few days," she said. "Not to be with anyone, just to be with myself. I need to listen to what's really going on inside me." Edward looked up slowly, sadness and understanding dancing in his eyes. "I get it," he said, "and I trust you." Grace reached out, took his hand, and for a moment, neither of them moved. They just breathed. The next morning, Grace packed a small suitcase and drove out to a quiet cabin in the hills. No cell service, no noise, just trees, sunlight, and silence. She brought a few books, a notebook, and her old journal from decades ago. There, in the stillness, she wrote, "I don't know where I'm headed, but I know I can't keep living by default. I need to rediscover who I am, not just as someone's wife or someone's possibility, but as me. And only then will I know where I truly belong." The cabin was small, tucked beneath old pine trees, with a wraparound porch and a view of distant hills. Grace arrived just as the sun was beginning to lower behind the trees, casting long golden shadows across the wooden floor. She unpacked only what she needed, a few books, her journal, a warm sweater, and made herself a simple cup of tea. The silence was startling at first. No dishwasher humming in the background, no Edward clearing his throat from behind a newspaper. No messages, no decisions to be made, yet. Grace sat on the porch as the sun faded, listening to nothing but the wind and her own breath. She realized it had been years since she had truly been alone, not just physically, but emotionally. For decades, every thought, every decision had been shaped by partnership, by what we needed, by what he might think. Now, for the first time, she was trying to hear only herself. The next morning, she found her old journal, the one she had started writing in before she became a wife, a mother, a hostess, a fixture in someone else's story. Flipping through the pages, she saw scribbles of dreams long forgotten. "I want to live a soft life," she had once written. "I want to grow things, be near beauty, and never lose the voice inside me." Somewhere along the way, that voice had gone quiet. Not silenced, but buried. Under birthdays and bills and keeping everything afloat. And now, Daniel had woken it. But Grace knew this journey wasn't about choosing between Edward and Daniel. It was about choosing herself first. Relearning how to live not out of duty or fear, but from truth. On the third day, her phone buzzed. "Daniel." A short message. I hope the stillness is treating you kindly. I think about you every day. She held the phone in her hands for a while, then smiled. She didn't reply, but her heart softened at the message. He hadn't asked for anything. He simply wanted her to know she was not forgotten. When she returned home, the garden was blooming. Edward was sitting outside, a book in hand. 2 cups of tea beside him. He looked up as she approached, and though he didn't smile right away, his eyes were warm. "I've been thinking," he said after she sat down. "Me too," Grace replied. "I realized something while you were gone," Edward continued. "Our marriage. It's strong, but it's also quiet, comfortable, safe, maybe too safe. And while I never stopped loving you, I might have stopped seeing you." Grace's eyes welled up, not from pain, but from recognition. "I stopped seeing me, too," she whispered. "And Daniel, he reminded me I'm still here, that I still have a voice." Edward nodded slowly. "Then I think we owe it to ourselves to find out what that voice is saying." He took her hand. "No pressure, no rush. I just want us both to be whole, even if it means reshaping everything." Later that evening, Grace sat in her room, journaling by the window. "I used to think change meant loss. Now I think it means permission. Permission to grow, to ask questions, to reclaim forgotten pieces of myself. I don't know yet if I'll stay or go, but I know I will no longer live half asleep." She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid of it. A week later, Grace returned home for good. There was no dramatic moment, no heavy bags, no declarations, just the quiet confidence of someone who had listened to herself, deeply, honestly, and now walked with clarity. Edward was in the kitchen. When she stepped in, washing apples for a pie he'd planned to bake, he looked up and simply said, "Welcome home." Later that evening, they sat on the front porch, their tea cooling between them. The garden was alive with spring blooms, white daisies, fresh lavender, and a new row of pink roses Grace had planted before everything changed. "I've thought a lot," she said, her voice calm. Edward nodded. "Me too. I want to stay," she continued. "Not because it's safe, but because I've seen the truth, and I still choose us. Not the way we used to be, but the way we could be, if we're both willing to really show up this time." Edward set down his cup, eyes gentle. "Then I choose that too." There were no cheers, no dramatic embraces. Just 2 people sitting side by side, choosing each other again, with eyes open this time. A few days later, Grace reached out to Daniel. They met at the same quiet park where so much had started. He was waiting with a small bouquet of wildflowers and a knowing look. She smiled softly. "I didn't come to explain. I came to thank you." Daniel nodded, understanding. "You reminded me of who I am," she said. "Not through promises or passion, but by simply seeing me. And I'll never forget that." He handed her the flowers. "You don't owe me anything, but I'm glad I was part of your rediscovery." They didn't hug. They didn't kiss. They just sat quietly, 2 souls acknowledging a connection that had served its purpose. Beautifully, but briefly. And then, with grace and dignity, they parted. That spring, Edward and Grace began to build something new. Not by pretending nothing had happened, but by honoring everything that had. They started walking together each morning, hand in hand, sharing stories, fears, dreams, some old, some new. They went on a short trip to the coast, not to rekindle anything, but to enjoy being present. One Sunday over breakfast, Edward said, "I've invited Daniel and Rebecca for dinner." Grace looked up, surprised. "Not to forget what happened," he said, "but to live without fear. without shadows. The evening was soft and light. No one brought up the past. They laughed over gardening tips, shared recipes, and talked about books. But behind every glance, every gesture, was a quiet respect, an understanding forged in truth. No one was pretending anymore, and that was the true beginning. One night, as they stood on the porch under a sky full of stars, Grace leaned into Edward's arms. "Do you ever wonder how we made it through?" she asked. He thought for a moment. "By letting go of who we were supposed to be, and learning to love who we are now." She smiled. "I love you, not out of habit, not because of time, but because today, I choose you." Edward kissed the top of her head. "And I choose you." In the quiet days that followed, Grace wrote in her journal. This wasn't a story about betrayal. It was a story about awakening, about being brave enough to ask, "Is this still who I want to be?" And then having the grace to begin again, not with someone new, but with a new version of myself and of love.